This is not about which childhood was better. American kids had great childhoods. European kids had great childhoods. But they were not the same childhood. And some of what happened in European homes, in European streets, in European schools was so specific and so normal to the children living it that explaining it to someone who grew up somewhere else is almost impossible. Almost. Here are 15 things that growing up in Europe gave you that nothing else could, and that Americans, through no fault of their own, never quite understood. 1. Walking to school alone at 6. In the 1970s, the average distance a British child was allowed to roam from home unsupervised was roughly 1 mile. By 2020, that distance had shrunk to 300 yards. Same country, 50 years. The world a child was permitted to inhabit alone had shrunk by 2/3 within a single generation. But in the 1970s and 1980s, that mile was real, and the walk to school was part of it. 6 years old, 7, walking alone, navigating the route independently, knowing which dog barked at the gate on the way, knowing which shop had the best sweets, knowing the shortcut through the park and the longer way round when there was time for it. That knowledge was not given. It was accumulated, walk by walk, morning by morning, over years of independent daily navigation. By 10, a European child had a relationship with their neighborhood that was physical and detailed and entirely their own. In America, the school bus was the standard, a yellow bus that came to a stop near your house. An adult drove you. The route was managed for you, or a parent drove you directly, the drop-off line outside the school, 10 steps from the car to the entrance. The American child knew the inside of that car very well. The European child knew every inch of a mile of streets. Both arrived at school, but they arrived knowing completely different things about the world. And that difference, accumulated over 12 years of daily journeys, added up to something that was very hard to explain to someone who had only ever been driven. 2. Playing outside until dark with nobody tracking you. You left the house after breakfast. You came back for lunch if you remembered. You went out again. You came back when it got dark. Your parents knew you were somewhere in the neighborhood. They did not know exactly where. They did not have a way of finding out. And this was considered a completely normal arrangement for a child of 7 years old. In America, through the same period, children were increasingly socializing through arranged playdates. One parent calling another parent, diaries consulted, a time agreed. The children were informed of the arrangement. The spontaneous knock on the door, "Are you coming out?" was being replaced by the scheduled visit. In Europe, the child knocked on the door themselves. If no one answered, they knocked on the next door. The courage required to do this was small, but it was the child's own courage, not arranged by anyone else, not scheduled in advance. Simply a child deciding they wanted company and going to find it. One system required adult coordination. The other required a child to walk to a door and knock on it. That small difference, practiced every day for years, produced something that is very difficult to describe to someone who always had the playdate arranged for them. A specific confidence in their own ability to find their way toward what they needed, without asking anyone to organize it first. 3. Building a den with no adult involved. During the long European summer, at some point in the first week, a decision was made, not discussed formally, simply arrived at through the accumulated restlessness of several children with too much time and not enough to do with it. They were going to build something. Wooden pallets from behind the supermarket, corrugated iron from the edge of a building site, old carpet dragged from a skip 2 streets away, a door that had been leaning against a wall long enough that its original owner had clearly given up any claim to it. No adult was consulted, no adult was involved, no adults provided correct materials from a hardware store. The engineering was debated seriously, whether the roof would hold, whether the entrance needed to face away from the wind. And then the politics arrived. Who was in? Who was out? Who had contributed enough to earn a permanent place? Who was allowed to visit but not stay? Who had been excluded following an incident, and whether the exclusion was permanent. These negotiations were conducted by children between the ages of 7 and 12, with no adult mediation and no appeals process. In America, children built tree houses, but the tree house was typically built with a parent, with a plan, with the correct wood, with an adult who knew what they were doing overseeing the result. The tree house was given. The den was made. Both were places where children went to be away from adults. But one of them, the children had built themselves from nothing, using nothing except what the neighborhood offered and what they could figure out between them. An American child hearing about the den for the first time understands the concept immediately, but the specific feeling of having built it yourself, of having negotiated who was in and who was out, of having made something from found materials that was genuinely yours in a way that a provided treehouse was not quite yours. That part does not fully translate. 4. The school exchange trip. At some point in secondary school, European children were sent to live with strangers in another country for 2 weeks, not as punishment, but as education. British students went to France, French students went to Britain, German students went everywhere. The whole continent quietly shuffles its teenagers across borders every year in the name of language learning and cultural understanding. Here is how it worked. Your school was paired with a school in another country. You were matched with a counterpart of roughly similar age. You went to stay with their family for 2 weeks. You slept in their house. You ate what they ate. You attended their school. You sat in lessons conducted in a language you were still learning. Then they came to your house, and your family did the same in return. American high schools did not do this. Not as a standard curriculum activity, not as something that happened to most students as a normal part of their education. The concept of being sent to live with a French family for 2 weeks, with no option to come home early, no parent available by phone at a reasonable cost, no familiar food or familiar school or familiar language to retreat into, was simply not part of what American schools considered a reasonable thing to do with a 14-year-old. And that gap is real, because what the exchange trip produced was not just language skills. It was the specific knowledge that you could be dropped into a completely unknown situation, in a foreign country, in a foreign family, with a foreign language, and find your way through it. That you were more capable than you knew, in ways that only became visible when everything familiar had been removed. An American child who never had that experience never got to find that out in quite that way. And that is something that no amount of explanation fully replaces. 5. Being left home alone at 9 as completely normal. On a Saturday morning in 1978, a European parent told their 9-year-old child they were going shopping. They said when they would be back, they left. The child was alone in the house for 3 hours, with instructions about what to do if something went wrong and the reasonable expectation that nothing would go wrong because the child was 9 and was perfectly capable of being in a house alone for 3 hours on a Saturday morning. This was not considered a risk. It was not considered a decision that required justification to other parents. It was simply a Saturday morning. In America, leaving a 9-year-old home alone for 3 hours was a decision that carried weight, that other parents would have had opinions about, that by the 1980s was beginning to attract the specific anxiety of a culture that was reassessing what children were capable of and what supervision they required. The gap between these two positions is not really about child safety. It is about what each culture assumed a 9-year-old was. The European assumption was competence. A child of 9 was a person who could be trusted with the house for a Saturday morning and would manage it without incident. The American assumption was moving toward protection. A child of 9 was someone who needed to be kept safe from the things that might happen if an adult was not present. Both assumptions were made with love, but they produced children who understood themselves very differently. One child knew from 9 years old that they were trusted with something real. The other child learned that the world required more caution than a 9-year-old could provide. That difference, in what a child was assumed to be capable of, ran through everything else about these two childhoods. And it started on a Saturday morning, with a parent who simply said, "I'm going shopping," and closed the door behind them. 6. Sitting at adult conversations and being expected to follow them. In European households, when adults gathered, the children were not sent to another room. They were at the table, not performing for the adults, not being shown off, simply present, expected to sit, expected to listen, expected to contribute occasionally when they had something worth saying. The conversations happening around them were not adjusted for their presence. Politics, money, illness, death. The actual concerns of adult life were discussed at a table where the children were sitting and paying attention. An American child at a family gathering was more likely to be directed toward a separate space. The kids' table, the room with the television, the garden. somewhere that allowed the adults to have their conversation without managing a child's exposure to it. The European child sitting at the adult table from the age of 7 or 8 absorbed something over years of those meals. An early understanding that the world was complicated, that the complications were not hidden from children, but simply part of the household conversation. That being young did not mean being protected from the reality of how things were. An American child of the same age, sitting at the kids' table, was being protected from something. The protection was well-intentioned. But the European child who sat at the adult table, who listened to conversations about things they did not yet fully understand, who gradually began to understand them, not through being taught, but through years of simple presence, had something, by the time they were adults, that the protected child had to find another way to get. The specific comfort of being in a room where serious things were being discussed, and knowing that they were allowed to be there. 7. Watered-down wine at Sunday lunch. Picture an American child spending a summer with a French family. The first Sunday lunch. The food is different but manageable. The table is louder than expected. The meal is longer than expected. And then the wine goes around. The French father picks up the child's glass without hesitation. Pour a small amount of red wine. Add water until the glass is mostly water with a faint pink tint. Place it back in front of the child. Continues the conversation without pausing. The American child looks at the glass, then look around the table. Nobody is watching. Nobody is waiting to see what happens. Nobody has registered that anything unusual has occurred. Because for everyone at this table, nothing unusual has occurred. It is Sunday lunch. The American child has approximately 2 seconds to decide what to do with a glass that a French parent has just placed in front of them as casually as a glass of water. And in those 2 seconds, every assumption their childhood gave them about children and alcohol is colliding with the reality of what is actually happening at this table right now. The French child beside them is already drinking without a thought, because there has never been a thought required. That collision between 2 entirely different sets of assumptions about something as ordinary as Sunday lunch cannot be explained in advance in a way that prevents it from happening. You can tell an American child that French families do this. You can explain the tradition, the history, the reasoning, and they will nod and say they understand. And then the glass will be placed in front of them on that Sunday, and they will look at it and understand for the first time that there is a difference between knowing something and having grown up with it. 8. Greeting every adult in the room individually. In France, a child who entered a room where adults were present had a specific obligation. Not a general hello to the room. Each person, individually, by name, with a handshake or a kiss on the cheek depending on the relationship. Making eye contact while doing it. Every time, without exception, and if you forgot, or rushed it, or tried a general wave at the assembled adults as a collective greeting. The correction came immediately. You did not say hello. Said by the adult who had not been greeted, in front of everyone, including your parents, who did not intervene because the adult was correct and the child needed to understand this. The child returned, greeted the adult properly, then continued into the room. In America, a child arriving into a room of adults might offer a general hi, or wave, or simply proceed to what they had come in for. This was not considered rude, it was considered normal. The adults were acknowledged, that was sufficient. The difference between these 2 approaches is not about politeness in the abstract. It is about how you are taught to see a room. The American greeting saw the room as a unit, one acknowledgement for all the people in it. The European greeting saw each person as a separate individual requiring separate recognition. That difference, practiced from the age you could walk, became a reflex that lasted for life. An American in a European social setting often feels, without being able to name why, that the Europeans around them are doing something with their attention that is slightly different from what they are doing. More specific, more directed, more present with each individual person in the room. That is not a personality difference. It is the result of having been corrected at the door, every time, for years. 9. Standing in the place where the war happened. American children learned about the Second World War in classrooms, from textbooks, from films, from teachers who had not been there, teaching from sources written by people who had also not been there. The history arrived in words and photographs. European children sometimes stood in the field where it had happened, In Germany, school trips to sites where the war had occurred became a standard part of the curriculum. Children of 12 and 13 stood in places where things had happened within living memory of their grandparents. In Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, school trips to war cemeteries were common. A coach journey, a file of children in coats moving through a gate, and then the headstones, row after row of identical white headstones extending further than the eye could easily follow. Each one with a name, a rank, a date, an age. Some of the ages were not much older than the children standing in front of them. At the end of some of these trips, there was a visitor's book. What a 12-year-old writes in a visitor's book at a war cemetery after an hour of walking between headstones reading names and ages is one of the most honest pieces of writing any human being ever produces. Because they have just understood something, not from a page, from the ground beneath their feet, that the history was real, that it had happened to actual people, that those people had been young, that young had meant something specific, in a specific place, that could be stood in and felt. An American child learned that the war happened in Europe. A European child stood in Europe and felt the war having happened. Those are not the same experiences. And no classroom, however good the teacher, fully bridges the gap between them. 10. Speaking another language before you were 10. At some point in primary school, a European child sat down in a classroom and began learning to speak in a different language. Not as an optional extra, but as a normal subject, as unremarkable as mathematics. A Dutch child learning English and French simultaneously from the age of 7. A German child learning English from 8. A British child learning French, reluctantly in many cases, from 7 or 8. In America, English was sufficient for almost every situation a child would ever encounter in daily life. At school, at the shop, on television, in books. The world in which the American child grew up was linguistically consistent. One language, everywhere. The European child grew up knowing from primary school that the world contained people who thought in completely different sounds, who could not be reached in English alone. But here is the detail that no language lesson fully prepares you for. A Dutch child on holiday in France, standing at a counter, needing an ice cream, having the French for ice cream and the French for please and the French for thank you and nothing else. Assembling those words, saying them out loud, to a real person, in a real situation where communication actually mattered. The person responding in French, the Dutch child understanding, or not understanding, and finding another way, and the transaction completing through a combination of pointing and patience, and the goodwill that exists between someone trying to speak your language and someone watching them try. That moment of needing a language and discovering whether you actually had it is something an American monolingual education simply did not produce. Not the classroom learning, the moment of genuine need, when the language was the only bridge available, and you found out whether you could cross it. 11. The unscheduled summer. 6 weeks of summer holiday, no camp, no organized activity programmed, no daily schedule created by a parent to ensure the time was used productively. Just time. In America, through the 1970s and 1980s, summer camps were becoming the standard middle-class response to the long summer break. Weeks with a schedule and supervision and structured activity from morning to evening. Sports, arts, academic enrichment, children occupied and supervised and safely engaged. The European child was simply left, with the neighborhood, with the other children from the street, with whatever presented itself on any given morning when you woke up with no particular plan and the whole day ahead of you. And here is what the unscheduled summer actually felt like from the inside. A Wednesday in August. The den has been built and explored. The other children are away or inside or busy with something else. The day is long and warm and completely without direction. You lie on the grass, you look at the sky, you go inside and look at the ceiling, you look out of the window, you go back outside. The discomfort of boredom is specific and physical, an energy with nowhere to go, a restlessness that has no object. And then, at a moment that cannot be predicted or engineered, an idea arrives. Not necessarily a good idea, but an idea. something to do that had not existed 10 minutes ago, and now existed completely and was immediately more compelling than anything organized could have been, because it was yours. Not suggested, not scheduled, not provided, found in the boredom by you, for yourself. An American child whose summer was scheduled from end to end never had to find that idea, because the schedule arrived before the boredom could, and so they never found out what the boredom would have produced, if it had been given the time. 12. Being expected to do real physical work. European children were useful, not in the chores and allowance sense, not tasks assigned with a reward attached and a negotiation about what constituted completion. Simply useful, as members of a household who were expected to contribute physical effort because that was what being part of a family meant. You carried things, heavy things, shopping bags that were genuinely heavy, furniture that needed moving, wood that needed stacking, a garden that needed actual digging with actual tools. Nobody gave you a smaller version of the tool because your hands were smaller. You used the tool. You figured out how to manage it. You contributed the effort that was required of you, and you did it because it needed doing and you were there. In America, the allowance system was well established. A list of tasks, a weekly payment upon completion, a negotiated arrangement between parent and child about what was expected and what it was worth. This was a reasonable system. It taught something about work and reward, but the European child's contribution was not negotiated, not compensated, not framed as a transaction. It was simply expected, because you were part of the household, and the household needed things done, and you were old enough to do them. The specific experience of being genuinely needed, not in an educational exercise way, in a real way, where if you did not do the thing would not get done, is something that the allowance system, for all its good intentions, does not quite replicate. Because the allowance system always contains a get-out. You can decide not to do the task and simply not receive the payment. The European child's contribution had no get-out. It simply needed doing. 13. The family meal where nobody left early. In European households, the family meal had a rule that was never stated because it did not need to be stated. You stayed until it was over, not until you had finished eating, until the meal was over, which was determined by the pace of the slowest eater and the length of the conversation and the particular direction the evening had taken, none of which you controlled, none of which you could hurry. You sat, you waited, you participated in the conversation because you were at the table and the conversation was happening and you were part of it. In America, the television dinner had arrived, a meal eaten from a tray in front of the screen, each person with their own tray, each person watching. The meal as individual consumption rather than shared occasion. Even at the family table, the American meal was moving toward flexibility. You ate when you were hungry. You left when you were done. The idea that the meal ended when the last person finished rather than when you finished was not the operating principle. The specific experience of sitting at a table after finishing your food, unable to leave, listening to your father complete a story that had begun before the main course, is one of the most universally recognized European childhood memories. Every European over 40 has a version of it. The specific adult who talked longest, the specific uncle whose stories had no clear end, the grandmother who ate slowly and set the pace of the entire table. You waited, and in the waiting, entirely without anyone planning it, you learned something. How to be in a room with other people without needing to be doing something. How to sit with the discomfort of having finished and not yet being released. How to be still. In a world that would spend the rest of your life trying to fill every moment with something. 14. The bus pass at 11. In America, independence arrived at 16, with a driving license, in a car, which required a parent to teach you, which required insurance and registration and a vehicle that someone had bought. One form of independence, requiring 16 years of preparation and a significant financial investment by adults on your behalf. The European child's independence arrived earlier, at 11 or 12, on a bus, with a small laminated card issued by the school or the local authority, valid on the local network, shown to the driver on boarding. The card was issued for travel to school. What it actually provided was considerably more. independent access to a public transport network. Every bus, every stop, any direction. On a Saturday, with nothing to do and the card in a pocket, a European child could go anywhere the network reached. And sometimes they did. A journey to the end of a route that had never been traveled. A walk around a part of the city that was technically the same city, but felt, from the outside, like somewhere else entirely. Then, the bus home. The American teenager felt independence arrive as a transformation, a before and after. The day the license came, the world changed. The European child felt their independence arrive so gradually, built through years of walks and bus journeys and small solo transactions, that there was no single moment of transformation. They simply looked up one day and realized they had been independent for years, without it ever having been announced. 15. Watching the news and being expected to have opinions. In European households, the evening news was watched by the whole family, not just the adults, everyone. And when it was over or during it, the conversation that followed included the children. Not in a gentle, age-appropriate way, in a genuine way. What do you think about what they just said? Do you think that was the right decision? What would you have done? Asked of a 10-year-old. At the dinner table, after the news, with the expectation of an actual answer, not a child's answer, a view, a position that the child had formed by paying attention and was now expected to articulate and defend if challenged. In America, the adult world was more likely to be kept separate from the child's world. The news was adult content. The political conversation was an adult conversation. Children were present in the household, but not necessarily expected to have formed opinions on what was happening in it. The European child who sat through years of family news discussions, who was asked what they thought and expected to say, who had their view challenged by a parent and had to find words to hold it or revise it, arrived at adulthood with something specific, not just political awareness. The specific comfort of being in a room where serious things were being discussed, and the specific confidence of knowing that their view was worth stating. Even when they were 10, even when they were wrong, even when the adult across the table was about to tell them exactly why. 2 childhoods, both completely normal to the people who lived them, both completely invisible to the people who did not. If you grew up in Europe, some of this will have felt less like a video and more like a memory you had forgotten you had. If you grew up in America, now you know what the gap looked like from the other side, what it felt like to be left alone in the world, and trusted to figure it out.